Comenius plants Praefatio, Prooimion, Theophrastus and taxonomy, how Theophrastus described and named plants. Peripeuton historia is a historia, an inquiry, a work of research, not a field guide, and its target audience were contemporary Greeks who were assumed by Theophrastus to be familiar in many cases with the plants he named. So his descriptions of plants are often brief or altogether absent. But when he needed to, his descriptions could be meticulous. If you try to describe a plant to a friend, you'll immediately realize that plant description is an art. What parts or aspects of the plant stand out to make it recognizable? What stage of development or season am I describing? How much data is too little or too much? In the area of plant description, the Parens Botanices was also a pioneer. To illustrate this, William T. Stern, in Botanical Latin, uses Theophrastus's description of the plant Theophrastus calls Heostrus, and we identify as the European hop hornbeam of the birch family, scientific name Ostrua carpinifolia. The context for the description occurs in Book 3 on the differences among trees that grow in the wild, uncultivated. In Section 10, he describes 4 plants, the beech, yew, hop hornbeam, and lime, that are monoides, that is, they are monotypic genera that he will only have to describe once without variance. Esti de kai heostrus monoides, hen calusitines ostruan, the hop hornbeam, which some of his contemporaries called ostrus, some ostrua, has also but one kind. Est et ostrus specie simplex, quam non nulli ostruam vocant. Homo puis te oxuae, te puteae, kai toi ploioi. It is similar to the beech, both in its growth or habit and its bark, tam corpore quam cortice fago vel schismae vicina. Theophrastus employs a descriptive device still commonly used, description by comparison, either to a plant better known, or in this case also to a plant, the Oxua or Fagus sylvatica, that he had just described a few paragraphs earlier. In the pictures, the 2 trees do look similar in their putea, or overall habit, but in modern classification, you have to go up to the order Fagales to find their commonality. He repeats this device in his description of the leaves. Pulida apio ede toi schemati plain promekestera poloi kai es oxu sunegmena kai mesdo. Apio ede toi schemati literally translated is pear-like in shape, but the sense is, as Hort notes in his English translation, that the leaves are pear-like at their base. The leaves are shaped like a pear's at the base, but they are much longer, narrowed to a point, and larger. Folio piri vicina, praeterquam quod id multo oblongius inque acutum depressius atque maius. Po luinoda apotes meses eltheas ca megales ton alon pleuro eidos cato tenuson, kai pacus ecuson. And the leaves are many-fibered, from a central straight large fiber, the other fibers stretching out like ribs, pleurae, and having thickness. Gaz's Latin translation is working from a different version of the Greek text, and so differs a bit in sense. Id nervo multiplici de medio constans, reliquis autem rectis in modum costarum, tum prolixius tum crassius porrectis. Eti de erutidomena catatas inas, cae caragmon econta cucloi lepton. Moreover, the leaves are wrinkled. Rutidao from he rutis, wrinkle, Latin ruga. Moreover, the leaves are wrinkled along the fibers and have a finely incised edge around them. Item id per nervos rugatum, et ambitu leviter serratum. This is about as detailed and precise a description of a leaf as you can get. In the previous presentation, we mentioned leaf venation as one of the characters distinguishing monocots and dicots, or eudicots. Based on Theophrastus's description of its leaves, do you think the hop hornbeam is a monocot or a eudicot? To dexulon scleron kai acrun eklokon. The wood is hard, colorless, and white. Materies dura, decolor, ex albida. I don't know if it's a false etymology, but ostrus is said to be related to ostun, Greek for bone. So he ostrus would mean tree with wood hard like bone. In the English name for the tree, hornbeam, beam is an Old English word meaning tree, akin to German Baum, and hornbeam means tree with wood hard like horn. Carponda micron, promacron, homoioncrite xanthon. The fruit is small, oblong, and yellow like barley. Fructus pusillus, oblongus, horda similis, colore flavus. Again, a comparison to another plant, this time barley. But the reference of homoioncrite is ambiguous. Hort takes it with yellow, yellow like barley. Gaza seems to take it with size and shape. Pusillus, oblongus, horda similis. Rhizaste ecce meteorus. It has shallow roots, radices sublimes. Enudronda kai parangodas. It loves water and is found in ravines. Aquas convalesque arbor haec amat. Theophrastus was also a proto-ecologist. One other observation. When discussing the plant parts in Book 1 from a philosophical perspective, Theophrastus proceeded up the plant's axis in the order root, stem, branch, bud, leaf, flower, fruit. In this descriptive part of the work, he proceeds in the opposite direction, presumably because for purposes of plant identification, the priority goes to the most visible parts. Stern notes that in its order and content, Theophrastus's description of the hop hornbeam is essentially the same as the 20th century one shown here from the botanist Alfred Raeder. The chief difference is that Raeder uses numerical measurements. Stern makes some interesting linguistic observations about the terms used in Raeder's description. The word tree and words for plant parts like bark, branch, leaf, cluster, nut, and tuft are good old common English words of Teutonic origin. The more technical words like pubescent, ovate, serrate, ovoid, and less obviously base, nerve, vein, and apex are of Latin origin. The use of these Latin words disguises the fact that the modern description is using the same comparative method as Theophrastus. Pubescent, for example, comes of a comparison with the hairs which appear on the body at puberty, pubes. Serrate from the comparison with a saw, serra. Ovate and ovoid from the comparison with an egg, ovum. The history of botanical terminology, says Stern, is essentially one of the gradual modification and combination of words linked to such comparative models. And, as we will see when we look more deliberately at Botanical Latin is the basis of the English language of botany. While the order and the content in the two descriptions are very similar, note that Theophrastus, but not Raeder, characterizes the plant's root, Rhizaste ecce meteorus. The opening chapter of Edward Lee Green's Landmarks of Botanical History is titled The Wreaths of Hanoi, the Root Gatherers. Green wants to emphasize that for the ancient Greeks and for people since time immemorial, the root was the most important part of the plant, economically and medicinally. The rhizotomoi were peasant women who supplied the plants to the apothecaries or pharmacologists, the pharmacopoli, who prepared the medicines for the physicians. One of the motivators for the study of plants over the centuries was to educate the pharmacologists and physicians on plant identification so that they would not be duped by these uneducated but clever peasant women. The rhizotomoi are also associated with magic and witchcraft, and the importance of the rhizotomoi in Greek society is suggested by the fact that rhizotomoi is the title of a lost play by Sophocles, a play thought to be related to Medea. But hey, don't take my word for it. You're learning Greek and Latin, so let's connect some dots. The first dot being Dido in Virgil's Aeneid, as she prepares her suicide after being abandoned by Aeneas. Stant arai kirk, et crinis effusa sacerdos tercentum tonat ore deos, erabumque caosque, tergemenam quecaten, ter avirgenis ora de anai. Altars encircled her. The loose-haired priestess shouted 300 gods' names, Erebus, Chaos, three-faced Diana, who is triple Hecate. In my English translation, I am borrowing from Sarah Rudin. Sparserat et latices simulatus fontes Averni. The priestess sprinkled drops she said were from Avernus. The Romans believed the volcanic crater lake in Italy they called Lake Avernus was an entrance to Hades. Falcibus et mes ad lunam quaeruntur aenis pubentes herbae nigricum lacte veneni. Herbs are sought, cut with bronze knives at the full moon, swollen and oozing coal-black milk of poison. Root gathering often involved some ritual. Notice that to be fully effective, the herbs must be cut at full moon. The illustration to the right is from the oldest manuscript we have of the Aeneid, the Vergilius Vaticanus, from around 400 A.D. It is also one of the few illuminated manuscripts we have of classical literature from late antiquity. At about the same time as that manuscript, Macrobius wrote the Saturnalia. The setting of the Saturnalia is a banquet of Roman notables of that period, though the time of the dramatic setting is a little uncertain, during the occasion of the pagan Saturnalian holiday, and a series of dialogues that ensue, a la Plato's Symposium. The participants are enthusiasts of the old religion and the old learning, at a time when the Roman Empire was officially Christian and paganism was on the brink of extinction, and the work holds a great deal of antiquarian interest. The 3rd through 6th books are about Virgil, including his debt to various Greek poets, like Sophocles in this passage. In Libro Enim Quarto, Vergilius Elissam facet, postquam ab Aenea relinquitur, velut ad sacricularum sagarumque carmina et devotiones confugientem, et inter caetera a et sedandi amores gratia, herbas quae citas, quae Aeneis falcibus secarentur. After Aeneas abandons Alyssa is another name for Dido, in Book 4, Virgil has her take refuge, as it were, in the spells and curses of witches and the sort of folk who lurk about altars. And among other things, he says herbs were sought to calm her passion, herbs cut with a bronze blade. And for the English translation, I'm using Robert A. Castor's for the Loeb edition with some modifications. Haec res non ne dignast, unde Vergilio Aeneae falces in mentem venerent? Ponam itaque Vergilianus versus mox, et inde Sophocles, quos maro aemulatus est. Don't you think it's worth asking how Virgil came to think of blades made of bronze? I'll quote Virgil's lines first, the speaker says, then the lines of Sophocles that Maro imitated. Maro is Virgil, Publius Vergilius Maro. Falcibus et mes ad lunam quaerunter aenis pubentes herbae negri cum lacte veneni. Sophocles autem tragoedia id de quoquaeremus etiam titulo praefert, inscribitur enim Rhizotomoi, in qua medeam describet maleficas herbas secantem, sed aversam ne vi noxii odoris ipsa interficeretur, et succum quidem herbarum in cados aeneos refundentem, ipsas autem herbas aeneis falcibus ex secantem. Sophocles' tragedy even has in its title the subject of our inquiry, for it's called Rhizotomoi, root cutters. In this play, he describes Medea cutting poisonous herbs with her head averted lest she herself be killed by the force of their noxious odor. She pours the herbs' juice into bronze casks and cuts the herbs themselves with bronze blades. Sophocles versus he sunt. Hed exopisa keros oma trepus, opon arginepe stasdonta tomes calceoisi cadois decatai. Keeping her gaze averted behind her hand, she receives in the bronze casks the cloudy white juice that drips from the cutting. Et Paulo post, haide caluptai cistai riston cryptusi Tomas, has heda boosa alalas domene gymne calceois ema drepanois. These covered baskets hide the root's cuttings, which she reaped with a bronze blade, with a cry and a shout, naked. And a final passage of special interest to our archaeology friends. Haec Sophocles, quo auctore sine dubio Vergilius protulet aeneas falces, omnin auto ad rem divinam pleraque aenea adheberi solita multa indicio sunt, et in his maxime sacris, quibus de lenir aliquos aut devover aut deniqua exigere morbos volebant. So Sophocles, whom Virgil doubtless took as his model in producing the bronze blades. Now there are plenty of indications that bronze implements are generally used for sacrifice, and above all in sacrifices that aim to soothe people or curse them or finally heal them of illnesses. So yes, Theophrastus most definitely included the root in his description of the hop hornbeam. Unless you think Theophrastus was unaware of the superstitious aspect of herbalism and the Rhizotomoi, let us add the last sentence of his description of the hop hornbeam, which William T. Stern omitted, presumably as being of no scientific value. Legatai de hos uc epitedion es oikian esperen, dus tanaten gar passi, kai dus token hu an e. It is said to be unlucky to bring the hop hornbeam into the house, since wherever it is supposed to cause a painful death or painful labor in giving birth. Domum infere minime idoneam tradunt, quippe mortiferam esse, et partus, quacunque fuerit, difficiles redere. I leave the topic of Theophrastus's plant descriptions with this piece of advice. If this Rhizotomos should come to you with a root and tell you it is from a hop hornbeam she picked in the woods, don't argue with her. Switching to nomenclature, how did Theophrastus name plants? Did he have a system of nomenclature, maybe something like the Linnaean binomial names we are used to? There's a simple answer to that. No. There was no need for one. It never occurred to him to call a plant anything other than by the name his Greek contemporaries commonly used. Nevertheless, the Greek names ended up having a long history. First, many of the Greek names were used by Pliny in his Naturalis Historia, and from there passed on to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, names like anemone, asparagus, and crocus. Second, as we will learn, the most influential plant book throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance was the Herbal of the Greek writer Dioscorides. Thanks to Pliny and Dioscorides, we kind of got used to associating Greek names with plants. Third, it happened that just as European botanists were confronted with the challenge of naming the hundreds of new plants finding their way into Europe during the Age of Exploration, they had rediscovered and were heavily influenced by Theophrastus, thanks to Theodore of Gaza's translation and to the printing press. And fourth, they were caught up in the vogue for Greek culture in general coming from the humanist movement. So Theophrastus used whatever names were common. Some of his names were binomial. Now all peoples and languages distinguish variations from a perceived basic prototype with a qualifier, such as Anna Pavord's quaint example from England of spreading hedge parsley, knotted hedge parsley, and upright hedge parsley. The Greeks were no different. But an extremely important part of botanical history is what Pavord called the naming of names, and as historians we especially want to understand what the Parens Botanices did with nomenclature. Our friend Edward Green wanted to, and he was particularly anxious that students of taxonomy not think they are seeing in Theophrastus Linnaean rules of nomenclature. To make this point, he made a meticulous study of the names Theophrastus used and how he used them. He came to three conclusions. In cases where Theophrastus and the Greeks recognized only one species, what Theophrastus calls monoides, and what we call a monotypic genus, there was no need for qualification, and so naturally their name for the plant is usually a single word, for example, cletra for the alder, ostrus for the hop hornbeam. In Linnaean nomenclature, even if the genus is monotypic, the sole species of the genus gets a provisional binomial name. For example, Linnaeus named the sole species of magnolia he was familiar with Magnolia virginiana. Where there are multiple species, we use the term type species for what we regard as the first identified or most representative species of the type. We now recognize some 210 species of magnolia, and we regard the Magnolia virginiana as its type species. According to Green, where Theophrastus and the Greeks recognized multiple species, such as for the pelke, the pine or fir, they still often used a single word name for what they effectively regarded as the type species of that genus. So, for example, in Green's view, Theophrastus regarded the Pinus picea or silver fir as the type species of the pelke, and therefore referred to it simply as pelke. But Green is skating on thin ice here. Identification of the plants named and described in the ancient authors is tricky business. According to Sir Arthur Hort's Index of Plant Names in the Loeb edition, which was published 10 years after Green's monograph, the unqualified name pelke in Theophrastus is SPP, meaning it is used for multiple species, not just the silver fir. Third, Green argues on the flip side that the Greeks in Theophrastus in some instances used a binomial name for a genus, whereas in Linnaean nomenclature, a genus can only have a single word name. Let's look at two of his examples, our sweet flag genus Ecorus, which Theophrastus calls by the binomial name Hocalamos eodes, and our serviceberry genus Melanchier, which Theophrastus calls by the binomial name Hesuke idaia, at least according to Green. Theophrastus was very familiar with kalamos, Greek for cane or reed. In Book 4, he discusses plants specific to particular geographical locations, and the kalamos is one of the plants he mentions from around Lake Copais in Boeotia. There are two kinds of kalamos, he says, hu de calamu duo pasin enai gene, ho calamos ho auletikos, and ho calamos ho plokimos. Auletikos, because its hollow stems are used to make reed pipes. Ho aulos is flute, and ho auletes, flute player. Theophrastus says there are a number of names in use for this reed. Some call it ho charakias, the stake or pole reed, from ho charax, stake, pole. Another name that has come down to us is donax. This is the reed the Romans call arundo, and our name for the species combines the Latin and Greek, arundo donax. Theophrastus's second species of calamos is hoplokimos, weaving reed, by contrast to the stout pole reed, a slender and weak speargrass used to weave baskets. Centuries later, Dioscorides called this the calamos pragmites, hedge reed, from ta pragmata, hedges. This has become our genus name for the common reed, pragmates. Theophrastus's two species of calamos are genera in our family, Poaceae. But to get back to Green's point, elsewhere in Book 4, concerning plants in Egypt, Theophrastus also tells us of a calamos elodes, the fragrant calamos. Ginatai ho papyros kai in Syriae periten limnen in he ho calamos ho elodes. Papyrus also grows in Syria, around the lake in which the fragrant calamos grows. He lists this fragrant calamos again in Book 9 among the plants in Syria remarkable for their fragrance, ta perita te osme. This plant is our sweet flag, scientific name Ecorus calamus. The genus name also comes from Dioscorides, who called it to akoron. Phylogenetic systematics has placed this monocot as the sole genus in a family Acoraceae, and Theophrastus too was using the name ho calamos ho elodes generically, that is, as a monotypic genus. Green raises two questions. Theophrastus was way too good a botanist to not know that sweet flag is an entirely different plant from the piper's reed and weaver's grass in Boeotia. Why then did he call the sweet flag calamos? And to boot, why did he give a binomial name to a monotypic genus? And the answer is very simple, because that's what folks called it. Green speculates that the name calamos elodes probably came from the Wreaths of Hanoi, who must have observed, besides the fragrance of the sweet flag's root, its close similarity in size, form, and color to the root of the arundo donax. Be that as it may, Theophrastus was not in the business of changing commonly used names. Another example Green gives of a binomial name for a genus is 2aiiiβ, the fig of Mount Ida in the Troad. Now the ubiquitous fig, 2 or ficus, we all think of, is the one Theophrastus himself already anointed early in Book 1 as a prototypical tree. Dendron to aporisdes monostelikes, hoion elaa, 2 ampelos. However, in Book 3 on wild trees, Theophrastus mentions a 2aiitis among trees peculiar to the region around Mount Ida. Idia kai tada ta periten iden, hoion hete Alexandria calumene dapne, kai 2aiitis kai ampelos. There are also these trees peculiar to Mount Ida, such as the so-called Alexandrian laurel, a sort of fig, and a vine. And he describes this sort of fig as shrubby and not very tall. Hede 2 tam nodes men kai uk hypsilon. Green and Hort identified this plant as the serviceberry shrub, or snowy mespilus, scientific name Amelanchier oalis. In their day it was called the Amelanchier vulgaris. Again, as his description shows, Theophrastus obviously knew this plant was not a, real fig. So why did he call it 2? Because that's how the people around Mount Ida referred to it. As to what Green alleges to be a binomial name for this monotypic shrub, 2aiiiβ, technically Theophrastus does not even use the phrase 2aiiβ, though of the 20-plus citations he makes to plants around Mount Ida in the Peripeuton Historia, he does use phrases like hepalkeidaia. In any case, Green again surmises the Idaean fig probably got its name because the country people in the region found the sweet fruits of this shrubby tree in some way suggestive of figs. Green rather beats his point to death, and his burning issue is probably not anyone's issue today, but in any case he makes the point. Theophrastus did not have a system of nomenclature. He simply used whatever plant names were common at the time. The fact that the Greeks sometimes used a single name, sometimes qualified names, is simply the way language works. As Green says, every plant name is really the name of a group. Naming is an act of classification. Where we need to, we qualify the group name. This raises the question, did Theophrastus have the concept genus and species like we do? And did he arrange plants within families or genera? That we'll consider in our final presentation on Theophrastus and taxonomy.